All right, I got the live Instagram feed rolling. So, fight fans, welcome to episode 2 of the ScrapYard podcast. You're listening to Mitch Ciccarelli and my boy, my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, Todd Jackson. Todd, what's up, buddy?
Hey, not a lot, man. Doing real good. Just kind of lounging around with my wife on a Sunday morning, watching fights last night, and looking at some stuff on the internet today, and just kind of interesting to recap and look at some of the things that have been going on around the sport.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. I think the past couple of weeks, there's been a lot of things going on, but a lot of crazy things going on. I mean, we talked about it a little bit in the last episode with the McGregor-Bellator thing, and then just a couple days ago, before this UFC Fight Night Sydney card, you got Colby Covington and Fabrizio Verdum going at it, where Verdum hits the guy in the face with, of all things, a boomerang. Like if that's not the most ridiculous headline in MMA history, I don't know what is.
Sydney, Australia, the term goes "when in Rome," right?
Right, exactly. Like, how bizarre. And before we get into that UFC Fight Night Sydney card, I was just reading an article on MMAfighting.com. It was actually a really good article from Mark Raimondi, I believe is his name, and he was kind of talking about how the UFC has been really silent recently when their fighters have been getting out of line. Talk about the McGregor thing last week, this thing with Colby and Verdum this past week, and it's kind of, I don't know, in my opinion, it's kind of setting a bad precedent because there is a code of conduct, and the UFC even established this code of conduct a couple of years ago, and they were enforcing it for a while, but now it seems like they kind of pick and choose who they decide to punish and bring those consequences to. Have you noticed that as well? What do you think about that?
Without a doubt, I've noticed it, and it's not something that's necessarily new to me. I think back to the early stages of John Jones' career where we didn't realize what a train wreck it would wind up being. This guy, so he made a mistake, he's young, he's got a lot of attention on him, maybe it's too much pressure. But, 5-6 years later, we're looking at the same exact mistakes, and maybe leniency in the first place wasn't the best option. And maybe if we didn't have that leniency to start off with, maybe the light at the end of the tunnel might have still been visible by the time they had a chance to turn it around for this guy. And that's just the point of one fighter. But, Fabrizio Verdum, this isn't the first issue we've seen with him kind of, I don't want to say getting out of line, because we don't know what these relationships are like. Obviously there's a personal beef with what happened with Covington and the Brazilian people. With that being said, Verdum was in Tony Ferguson's face about a month and a half ago at a press conference. I mean,
right.
Talking about one of the craziest, biggest heavyweights we've ever seen. Talking to a 55er, he was going to actually do something.
Yeah.
It's something to think about,
I was thinking the same thing when he went after Ferguson a couple months back. I'm like, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? He's like one of the biggest heavyweights in the world, and he's picking fights with the lighter weight fighters. And listen, I mean, I don't blame him for his his issue with Covington. I mean, I would feel the same way. I'm very passionate about my country, obviously. If somebody from a different country were to get in my face and insult the United States of America, I mean, of course, I'm going to respond. But, I mean, Verdum hitting the guy with a boomerang, I still can't get over that, but that is hilarious. But apparently he also punched him in the face. I don't condone that kind of behavior. I'm never a fan of guys, street fighting. I'm big on these athletes acting like professionals. And when they don't, I don't think there's any room for that, But I think both guys are at fault, and it's just, I think the organization should come down on them in some extent. There's got to be some kind of consequences, because this is setting a bad precedent. Now you're going to see fighters doing this more often. You had the McGregor thing last week where he jumps into the cage when he's not even, first of all, you can't jump into the cage or jump on the cage at all to begin with. I mean, yeah, we've seen fighters do it in celebrations before, but it's always been against the rules. But to have somebody do that who's not a part of the corner or even part of the fight, jump into the cage and not rule out any kind of consequences, I mean, it's still kind of early, but man, I mean, I think that's dangerous, especially in a sport as violent as a combat sport like mixed martial arts.
You really, you're preaching to the choir on that one. If we go back to the cage thing in particular, something that has stood out to me, you revisit these things throughout the week, you kind of reanalyze, what do I really think about this? And one thing that stood out to me was security. Conor wasn't your plane. Conor wasn't in the corner. He wasn't a part of the team. He wasn't supposed to they sit in a seat next to the other people that paid to sit in their seat. How did we get in that cage? I mean, to me, that's a concern for the fighters. I mean, you think back to what was it, like the '86, maybe even earlier, the World Series the Yankees won. You got the guy he's running around the bases and he's swarmed by men. You know what I mean? He's like having a linebacker just out of the way. I mean, even one of those guys could have a knife on him or something. It's been crazy. You know what I'm saying? So not to point to some sort of potential disaster that could or couldn't happen, but the idea being the fighters feel like, yeah, this is my workplace, I should be safe in here. And that goes for the guy laying on his back and the guy with his hands in the air too. So, yeah, man, I feel like you look at baseball in particular, or football to a certain degree, you've got these expectations. You mentioned code of conduct. If I go out there and I throw a pitch at a batter, and that batter throws his helmet down the ground and charges me, and we start throwing chingachos, we're both going home for a few days. We know that before we ever take a step towards each other. So you have to understand, A, that there are consequences that you cannot work around, and B, that those consequences are there whether you behave or not. And if these guys do step out of line and step outside of those boundaries, then there should be a predetermined, hey, you're at least getting suspended for a fight or a certain time frame, whatever. You know, they get medical suspension. Why can't they get disciplinary suspension?
Definitely. Well, let's talk about some of these fights from last night. I mean, and I hate to like complain about these cards, but man, that was an awful fight night card, man. I mean, I gotta give some slack to the matchmakers because, granted, it's an unpredictable sport. You don't know what's going to happen when they actually get in there and step into the cage. But a lot of the fights they made last night, I'm sitting there thinking like, I knew this was going to suck before it even started. You know what I mean? It's one of those things like, there's so many fighters on the roster these days. They do so many fight cards, so it is kind of challenging to always deliver. But when pretty much every single fight on the card, except for that one prelim fight between Frank Camacho and Damian Bryan, which we'll get into a little bit later on, aside from that fight, the rest of them, man, pretty forgettable.
Yeah, nothing really stood out to me that I'm going to be talking about it a week from now. That being said, there were a few that were better than others. We were talking about Colby Covington a few minutes ago. Muhammad coming out on top over me, and I kind of like the way he called out Covington. I think that we talked about this last week. You try to adopt that role of being a heel, so to speak, and a lot of people the wrong way. It kind of puts a target on your back, and people took notice of what he was saying over there. So. Yeah,
and definitely. And Bilal Muhammad, man, he's somebody that I've been paying attention to for a long time. He's a former Titan FC welterweight champ. My good friend and colleague Brian Levick, God rest his soul. He was one of the Titan. Actually, he was the Titan FC PR guy, and he did a lot to kind of like get Bilal Muhammad into the spotlight, so to speak. So I remember Brian always talking about Muhammad and always hyping him up, and rightfully so. The guy is somebody that's definitely on the rise. I think that's smart to call out those big names. I'm not really sure they're going to give him that fight because Colby's obviously, I think he's ranked like number 3 right now. So Bilal, I don't believe Bilal Muhammad is ranked in the top 15 yet. He might be top 15, but he's not like higher up there. But I like that we talked about that in the last episode. I like the fact that these fighters are not just saying that they'll fight whoever the UFC gives them anymore. Now they're actually kind of coming out there with a plan to kind of call their shots, and I think that's awesome.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you can capitalize on the momentum of somebody else, and especially if you can find a way to, in some way, shape, or form, not just, I don't know, it's combat arts to punch each other in the face, but we want to see them not only do that and enjoy it, but if there's a story behind it, like this guy doesn't like it because of this reason, that just adds layers of excitement to it for the fans, and that's what we all are at the end of the day, is we love watching these guys fight. I think the guys that they call each other out, it seems like there's this perceived beef, but then at the end of that, like, hitting each other and stuff, which is super cool. It's a sign of respect, but I like those genuine beefs where people are like, I don't like you. And I'd like to play punch base with you for about 15 minutes.
Right? Exactly. And I'm the same way. I think, I'm not the type that likes to see, like, these guys fake it, you know what I mean? Because a lot of times they'll do that. Right. They'll fake a grudge with somebody. So that I'm not too much keen on. But when it's real, when these guys really don't like each other, that's the big difference between this sport and so many other sports, is that, in baseball, for example, you can't have guys fighting each other on the field if they don't like each other. I mean, sometimes you see that, but like you said, they get suspended a couple games when they do that. In MMA and in boxing and in combat sports, these guys are going to fight at the end of the day. So that's what makes it so exciting. It's like when there is like a real rivalry between two fighters, it gets you more amped up to see them throw down. And that was kind of the case here with that Elias Theodoro Daniel Kelly fight. But man, that was really weird, very sloppy. You and I were talking on Facebook Messenger during that fight, and you had said something. You were like, "Man, this is like watching a fight in a high school cafeteria or something like that."
It was crazy, man.
Man, give me your take on that, because two really weird styles, two unorthodox fighters, not the most aesthetically appeasing fight, to most people.
Definitely not. And here's, and I have to say this because it's just, I gotta look these guys in the eyes, you gotta look them in the eyes. Maybe I'm never gonna bump into Theodoro, but at the end of the day, that could happen someday, and I gotta be prepared for that. So I always try to preface my critiques with saying, yeah, I'm not a fighter, I've never been in there. You know, like I said, I have to be warriors. But at the same time, when you watch enough of these fights, you get an idea of what's a solid quality product. And I'm not saying these guys don't both deserve to be in the UFC, but sometimes you get two fighters that match up well, that like bring the best out of each other. It almost seemed like these guys were like the exact opposite of complementing each other's styles. I mean, you know, you got a guy like Kelly who's a veteran and a judo guy, been around combat arts forever, and then you got Theodore who's just taking his first steps basically into the style of stages of his, his career. But watching Theodoro kick, and listen, I came up as a martial artist. I've never fought, but I've competed in martial arts and wrestling. So I understand what a good kick looks like. And at the end of the day, the kicks that he was throwing, like he had his back turned and was just kind of flinging the leg out there.
Right.
And he said something at the end of the fight that really resonated. Once he said it, it kind of made sense. And it was to the effect of, hey, the most important thing is at the end of the day, you get your hand raised. Not all fighters would agree with that. You know, when Donald Cerrone throws a kick, he's trying to go home for the night. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Throwing kicks around just to touch him, and they were coming from weird angles, and they weren't effective, but they were adding up. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know. And then Kelly there's no way for this guy to go backwards or what. Charging forward the whole time, just swinging punches like rock and soccer robots. It was painful to watch.
Yeah, Kelly is he's almost kind of like, I don't want to say like funny to watch fight, because I don't want to insult the guy, because he's been around for a very long time. He's been practicing judo for like Theodoro said, longer than he's been alive, longer than I've been alive.
Right.
I think he's like 40 years old, and definitely is a very capable martial artist. But man, I couldn't help but like chuckle a little bit watching him, just lunging forward and just very like unorthodox, kind of like Keith Jardine style. Almost. But you made a good point there when you mentioned what Theodoro said after the fight, where he talked about like all that matters is getting your hand raised. And it's kind of one of those fine lines, because on one hand you kind of want to agree. I mean, and we're fightpurist.com. We're all about the rankings and things like that. So on that hand you kind of do agree with that. But I look at guys like John Fitch, for example, and Jake Shields and guys like that were, ranked up there in the rankings in the UFC, were winning fights, only ever really lost to like the top tier guys, and the UFC still cut them because they just were not delivering. And I was pretty vocal against that, because I felt like even though Fitch wasn't the most exciting guy to watch, he was still one of the top 5 guys in the division at that time. So I didn't really necessarily agree with that. But now looking back, I mean, all these years later, it kind of does make sense, So I could see, and there's so many guys in the roster now that any chance they can get to make it less oversaturated, So Elias has got to be careful with that. He's got to start winning in more spectacular fashion, because he keeps winning these fights like that. He's probably not going to be sticking around too long in the organization.
Yeah, I would agree. 2 things that I'll say about that. Not to harp on these guys all day, but with Theodoro in particular, I feel like he showed the capability to be able to be accurate with strikes and not just your orthodox 1-2 combos. I mean, he was putting combinations together and fighting from awkward angles, which for some people can turn that into an art form. So I think if this guy gets a little more committed to his own talent, and hey, I can hurt people with these weapons instead of just touch them. He might be dangerous, but that's up to his corner and his coaching staff to figure out for him. But something I want to say in general about the sport as a whole, and we'll segue into this later with Jose Torres as well, but you watch amateur fighters, I don't know how people have to fight. I call fights for the World Fight Federation, and one of my favorite aspects of being at these live events at the local level watching amateur guys come out. Because the thing is now these guys, that they don't get paid doesn't necessarily mean they're amateurish in their abilities. So you have kids coming out of camps where you've got professional fighters and they roll with these guys and they train with them every day and they come out looking like polished fighters, because if you spend enough time bouncing off of Henry Cejudo on the floor, you're going to start wrestling better. You know what I mean? So if you're spending any time on the mats with a guy like that, you're going to reflect that, and you're reflecting him in a certain way. So my point is, I've seen amateur fighters that put together better performances than those two guys did last night, and it makes me wonder, where's the UFC? Maybe they need to start looking at a little broader spectrum of where they're picking up their fighters, not just where they train. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And real quick, I want to give a shout out to my Instagram Live viewers. So we got this going on Instagram Live right now. We got a couple people tuned in, and I want to give a shout out to Kristen619 who said hey. So hey back to you, Kristen. And hopefully you guys are enjoying the podcast so far. If you have any comments or questions, just put them on the live feed here, and I will answer them and ask them to Todd, and we'll go back and forth. But yeah, man, I completely agree. You know, there's a lot of guys on that UFC roster now that they might have big records. They might have been around for a couple of years, but there's guys in other organizations that are outperforming them. And I feel like if they got the chance to fight them in the UFC, you know, these up and comers would probably put a stamp on some of these veterans. You mentioned Jose Torres. We'll get into him in a little bit, but he's one that I'm definitely got my eye looking out for. And you know what? And speaking of that, to that point, I want to talk about Will Brooks for a second. Will Brooks, former Bellator lightweight champion. This guy was killing fighters in Bellator. He looked like a world beater. And when he made that transition to the UFC, he came with a lot of hype, as he should have, you know, as a Bellator champ. Everybody was thinking, man, this guy's going to be the next UFC champion. He's going to be, main eventing pay-per-views. And had a pretty good first fight with Ross Pearson. He got the W, but lost like 3 or 4. I think it's like 3 fights in a row now after last night when Nick Lentz choked him out. What are your thoughts, man? And do you think, because we've seen this before where, you know, a couple of years ago when the WEC was around, and even Strikeforce before the UFC purchased them both, you know, it was kind of that thing where like everybody thought like the UFC fighters were superior, and then you saw the WEC guys and Strikeforce guys transitioned into the octagon and making names for themselves. You know, a lot of guys are champions right now that came from WEC and Strikeforce. So a lot, you know, because of that, I think people were kind of coming with high expectations for a guy like Will Brooks. And, do you think him losing 3 fights in a row is an indication that the Bellator, lightweight division is maybe not as deep as we thought it was? Or do you think it's just a situation of a guy maybe believing his own hype and not being able to live up to it?
That's a tough question to answer for me. And the reason why is I feel like there's multiple layers to it. I point to a guy like Fabricio Verdun, who has beat how many former UFC champions, and Fedor, and this guy, he's bounced around from organization to organization and been able to accomplish that across the board. Then I look at a guy like Zach McCoskey, who came over from Bellator. He was wrecking people in Bellator. You couldn't stop that kid's wrestling, but he got to the UFC and makes him appear very human. But the flip side is true when you look at a guy like Benson Henderson, who, for a time, I thought he was going to go on a run. He was really impressing me against the best the division had to offer. And then he goes to Bellator. And again, I'm not saying that he's outclassed by any stretch of the imagination. He's competing, right? These guys are putting up competition against him. So, Will Brooks, I feel like it's what he makes of it. These guys don't get to this level typically, and especially with the success rate that a guy like Will Brooks had at Bellator without having it inside of him. It may be like transitioning from playing for the Kansas City Royals to playing in New York City or Los Angeles for a ball player, where Will Brooks might be a little taken back by the circumstances of the big show. You never know, but you can point to any number of things. Who knows what's going on behind the scenes with this guy? Is it the hype? It's hard to say, man. But I've seen so many fighters transition back and forth, organization to organization, and different results for different fighters. Look at Mandalay. He's been everywhere. So I don't know, man. It's a hard thing to really pinpoint. And if I had the time to sit down and really think about that, I think I could come up with some really solid examples of how people match up equivalent from one place to the next. But Will Brooks is going to have to bounce back. Nick Lentz choked But at the same time, he's got to go back to the drawing board. Hopefully, the drawing board's still there for him. I mean, you lose enough fights, like talking about the UFCs, they got a quick trigger finger on cutting people loose.
And, and credit to Nick Lentz. That guy is a badass. He's probably, you talk about underrated fighters. He's been underrated for a very long time. The guy typically usually wins, and usually wins pretty impressively. And last night, he looked awesome, choking out a former teammate. And then I loved his post-fight interview where he's kind of calling out like American Top Team and his former coach Dan Lambert, where he's like, I love ATT. I come from ATT, but I tell you what, Dan Lambert, I got 500K or 50K, whatever the amount was, that nobody at ATT could beat Nick Lentz, and I fucking love that. And then they asked him, they're like, hey, who do you want to fight next? He's like, line them all up like Mortal Kombat. I don't give a shit. And and like we just talked about, usually I like it when a guy has somebody else in mind, but his answer was just so entertaining that that's like the one exception to the rule, right? Like if they could make that entertaining, like just line all those sumbitches up and I'll knock them all down. Like what I didn't like was like years ago when these guys would be like, oh, whoever Dana White and Lauren, and Joe Silva want me to fight, I'll fight. It's like, dude, like that was your opportunity, to make a name for yourself after doing what you did in the cage. And I think Nick Lentz, more people now, I mean, granted, I don't think a lot of people were watching that fight, but those who did are talking about him a little bit more than they were before.
Of course. Yeah, and, right after their fight, you had 3 rounds between Benoit and Mokhtarian.
Oh, yeah.
And Benoit, the way he was able to, just to fast forward to the finish, the way he was able to continually work and with his kicks to be able to set up that high kick, it's an art form, in my opinion, to be able to chop at that leg and really irritate and agitate that leg. And it's one of the most underutilized techniques, in my opinion, at least at my level where I am watching MMA at the local level, but even in the UFC and Bellator. Kick that leg, man. Kick it over and over again.
Absolutely.
Even if it's just little touches. Because at the end of the day, that's going to get annoying to the point, or painful to the point, where the human body's going to drop the hand to protect it. And guess what happens? That kick goes high, and boom, that's all she wrote. And I've seen it time and time again when people set it up. And you can almost see it coming, which maybe that's why it's not utilized as much. But the idea, being able to pull it off, Benoit did a beautiful job of that.
Yeah, Benoit looked awesome. That was a beautiful knockout. And, we're talking, like, this card was probably built more on the prelims, because there were some pretty good fights in the prelims. That was one of them. Right. Frank Camacho and Damian Brown, that was a slugfest. You kind of feel bad a little bit for Camacho because he won the fight but didn't make weight, which, again, like, it's one of those weird things because it's like, I don't want to say I feel bad for him because of that, because it's his job to make weight. But after a performance like that, it's like shit, because he's not going to get the bonus for it, because he can't get paid the bonus for basically not making weight, no matter how exciting that fight was. But I love the fact that, and I just read this interview he did after the fight where he acknowledged that, hey, I had an amazing fight with Damian Brown. Damian Brown made me a better fighter, and it's great to get the W, but I didn't make weight, and I can't take the fight of the night bonus, but I'm hoping that the UFC will give that to my opponent, Damian Brown. I thought that was just like completely something you don't see every day. It's kind of like a true martial artist, kind of like showing respect to a warrior after kind of doing battle with him. I thought that was awesome. Did you see that interview, or was this like the first time that you heard about that?
That's the first time you told me about that. So no, I have not seen it. But you gotta understand, those are the things to me that really always have attracted me to MMA. Is obviously it starts out like we're talking about the schoolyard fight. I just want to see two people fight. That's something I've always been a fan of, is combat arts. But when you start hearing about some of the honor, and again, having been raised in a martial arts environment from a young age, that was really preached heavily to me as a kid. And to think that this guy's like, hey, you know what? I didn't do my job. I didn't pull my part of the deal in, but I know that we earned some money, and this guy made me a better fighter. Hats off to him. Give him the whole thing. I love that, man. I absolutely love that. And it reminds me of a Nicaraguan fighter now. I'm not going to be able to remember his name. Ricardo Villorga. Ricardo Villorga, I watched an interview with him once. It was translated. Of course, he's from Nicaragua. And he talked about his time. It was the early De La Hoya days. I mean, he was a wrecking machine, but he wasn't like one of these boxers, but he was always in the picture.
Right.
Long story short, they asked him, like, You live in the ghetto, bro. You're making millions of dollars on these fights. You live in the ghetto. I win these fights. I win this money, and I give the money back to my community just to keep enough to live. Because if I'm rich, I'll never be hungry enough to get out of bed and train in the morning. I'll never want to go down to the gym and do 3 a days and stuff like that. So, to have that type of mentality, that the money isn't necessarily there for what it's all about. That's just a byproduct of the glory of the victory. I really buy into that type of mentality. That resonates.
Same with me, man. And so last thing we'll talk about from this card, we do have to bring up the main event between Fabrizio Verdum and Marcin Tibieria, which I thought it was hilarious. Dan Hardy, who's calling the fight alongside, I can't remember the other guy he was broadcasting with, but it was a weird night of commentary for those guys, man. I don't know if you picked up on that, and granted,
yeah, there were some awkward moments.
Yeah, and it's not an easy job. I mean, I know you've probably called a couple of fights, as well. You have some experience doing that, so you can probably speak to it more than I can. It's not an easy job, and of course, you're gonna mess up along the way. But yeah, it was an awkward night. He called Marcin Tibieria Marcin held at one point.
Yeah, he called him Marcin held. That's right.
Yeah. And his broadcast partner was like, "Nah, man, that's Tibieria, not held. Held is a lightweight." But
all the time, bro.
Yeah, and it's a tough job.
I can definitely speak from experience.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has to do with who you're sitting next to. But I'm in Arizona. I got 17 Lopez's. When I walk down the street, that's because we're surrounded by the proud Mexican people, and they love their combat art. So sometimes I'll get the names, I'll try to refer to guys during the fight. Lopez is taken down, Castillo, and then I'll get the first name mixed up because I know 3 different Mr. Lopez's. You know what I mean?
Right.
It can get confusing at times. But the thing that stood out to me too was in one of the earlier fights, his partner said to me, "He's treating him like a wet tracksuit."
Yeah.
Did you say a wet tracksuit? He's like, "Yeah, like when it's wet."
That's almost as bad as Mike Goldberg from back in the day, what he would say his precision is precise, and Joe Rogan would be like, "Well, okay," and actually,
go ahead.
No, you go ahead, brother. What were you saying?
I was just gonna mention real quick. I will say, especially being someone who does call fights, I try to learn from these guys, and having never stepped foot inside of a cage in a combat environment, I mean, I have to hear what people that know what they're talking about say, and I have to try to adapt that and learn from it and make it my own. And I feel like when Dan Hardy talks about MMA, I feel like I'm learning something by the end of the fight. So I asked him for that, and I appreciate that as a fan. So I did learn a lot listening to him.
Yeah, Dan Hardy's a great guy. I mean, I got to give him a hard time a little bit because it's fun, but I do love hearing him most of the time calling fights. I prefer seeing him compete. I mean, I wish he still could.
Yeah.
Obviously, he can't anymore. And we're always, you got to look out for the safety of the fighters, and he's able to make a better career for himself in the broadcast table than he is in the octagon. But every time I see him, man, I'm like, dude, I wish he still had that red mohawk and he was still throwing bombs. But getting into this Verdum fight. So anytime a heavyweight fight goes the full 5 rounds in a main event, more often than not, it's not going to be the most exciting fight in the world. The exception to the rule, of course, is Mark Hunt and Bigfoot Silva when they had that crazy back and forth war for 5 rounds. I don't even know how the hell those guys were standing up at the end, but this was not one of those fights. It wasn't horrible. It wasn't that bad. It was it was what it was. Verdum and Tibieria stood up for 5 rounds. Verdum got the better of him in most of those exchanges. You really kind of see Verdum, his Muay Thai getting better over the years. And again, I gotta give Dan Hardy shit again because he made a comment during this fight where he said Verdum's striking is almost as dangerous now as his jiu-jitsu. I was like, come on, man, that's a little bit of a stretch there. Verdum, probably the best jiu-jitsu guy in the world in the heavyweight division, maybe in all of MMA. An argument can be made. Striking, nah. I mean, he's capable on the feet. He shows it in his fights. He gets better standing up. Good in the Muay Thai clinch, but not somebody you would rank on a piece of paper and say, one of the best strikers in the heavyweight division. What was your take on the fight, man? What do you think is next for Verdum moving forward here?
Well, I have to agree with you. The striking of Verdum, I would like to go back to that. Something that was standing out to me, and when you're as large as these men are, to be able to throw your body parts around in a fluid capacity intensity. It's easier said than done, and I noticed his kicks were really stale, like just kind of throwing the ankle out there, not like turning the hips, not really techniquing it, I guess you would say, and really just kind of lazily. And that went for both of them. We talked about the Muay Thai form. Hardy pointed to that a couple times, how impressive it was. But it seemed like Tibira was able to kind of shake it off every time that Verdun got it. So one thing I think about is peaking for a fighter. Verdun fought, 10 minutes ago, and choked got that arm bar in the first round.
Right.
30-minute slight change. So, I mean, maybe he had already peaked, and maybe he's looking a little lighter in the striking department because of that. I don't know. But as far as the fight goes, Tibira being able to go 5 rounds with Verdun, who's a known finisher, that's impressive to me. To be able to weather some of those storms, especially on the ground, I saw a couple times where I was like, oh, that's a wrap. And Verdun wasn't able to seal the deal, so to speak. And Verdun on the feet, I felt like he should have been able to put him away, but wasn't able to. So I feel like if I'm impressed with either of these guys, it's Tibira.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go so far as to say that was his most impressive performance, but then again, the strength of schedule, who was he competing against? You had to be careful. I liked some of the information that was coming from Winklejohn. Keep the distractions up. He kept saying that. Keep the distractions up, because then the things that follow are going to work for you. And he did that very well. And something that I speak to a lot is how a fighter responds to their corner. And I feel like Tibira is a great student of his corner. And so that really stood out to me.
I agree with you, man. I'm impressed with anybody for the most part that can go the distance with Fabricio Verdum, win or lose, because most of the time, I mean, you talked about it, he's a finisher. He's going to get you to the ground,
right,
or he's going to get taken to the ground at some point, and he's going to find a way to get that submission. So Tibira, he looked like a guy that you can tell he's going to be around for a while, and he's going to be doing some good things in that division, but not his time yet. If he continues to work with Mike Winklejohn and Greg Jackson, I think we're going to see some big things coming out of him in the future. Now, as far as Verdum, and I tweeted this on my Twitter account last night, I was like, listen, Verdum is one of those guys that 90% of heavyweights are going to lose against him. The 10%, actually, no, I said 95%. I gave you even more credit. I said 95% of heavyweights are going to lose when they fight Verdum. The 5% are guys like Stipe Miocic, guys like Alistair Overeem, which I thought Verdum beat him the last time they fought, but Overeem got the W via decision. And then I also said there's another guy who I think could be in that 5%, who I think is going to be the breakout star for 2018. Let me know if you agree with this. Francis Ngannou. What do you think about that motherfucker? That's a badass right there.
Oh, man. That's a wrecking machine. That reminds me of Anthony Johnson. Just pure power, aggression, and there's a controlled chaos to it, too. Like, not afraid to engage to create those openings. You see some fighters, and I feel like Martin was doing this last night, fighting a little timidly, because you do give respect to the finishing capability of a guy like Verdun. But, there are other guys that aren't so afraid to take that risk to put their doom into your world. So, and definitely Ngannou is one of those guys. So I think you're right. I won't be shocked if he comes out and turns a lot of heads this year. Definitely looking forward to seeing what the future of his career brings.
He's got a really tough test with Alistair Overeem, because Overeem is still the best pure striker in that heavyweight division. I mean, he won the K1 Grand Prix, which is, for those who are familiar with kickboxing and striking, they know how significant that is, what that really means. And he's been able to carry that over. He's phenomenal. So, but the thing is, though, his chin is a little suspect these days. And I think if Ngannou is able to clip him, I think he could do something there. But it just depends if Overeem can out technique this up and comer and kind of like nullify his power and maybe even stop him how he's been stopping a lot of guys. But it's interesting, man. It's a toss-up. I think either way, Ngannou is going to be a star, whether it's going to be 2018 where he breaks out or the next couple of years after getting some more big fight experience. But he's somebody I've had my eye on. And speaking of guys that we have our eyes on, I wanted to talk about Titan FC 46. I watched a little bit of it from UFC Fight Pass this past weekend. We mentioned my good buddy Brian Levick, I'm sure he's probably watching up there. Brian was the PR rep for Titan FC, and we talked about this in the last podcast. Him and I have done podcasts for years together, and then he started doing amazing things for Titan. So I try to pay homage to him as much as I can, And he was a big believer in this kid, Jose Shorty Torres. I remember him telling me a couple years back, he's like, we're about to sign this guy, Jose Torres. He's the #1 ranked amateur in the world. He had like 25-1 for a record as an amateur, which is pretty damn impressive. I mean, the amateur scene in MMA is doesn't get enough credit, and a lot of guys try to jump that amateur circuit like really too quickly and get into the pros. And Jose Torres did it the right way. He spent 3 years in the amateur circuit, had about 30 fights, 27 fights, and then transitioned into professional mixed martial arts with Titan FC. He's 6-0. He's a double weight champion, which is kind of like how Conor McGregor was in Cage Warriors and in the UFC. He is their Titan FC flyweight and bantamweight champion. But unlike McGregor, this kid actually defends both titles at the same time. He just defended the 135-pound title with a submission victory over Gleison de Jesus, I believe was the guy's name. What are your thoughts, man, on Torres, and do you think he's going to be a phenom in the UFC in the next couple of years or so?
I'll tell you what, there are a couple of points that stand out to me about this young man, and you took the words out of my mouth about the amateur scene being underrated. Making money, let me be real brutally honest with the casual fans that may not realize this. Making money in MMA is like you might afford the gear that you use for the training camp. These guys aren't making money at the local scene. I mean, you got to be able to put 500 to 1,000 asses in the seats to be able to really sell a promoter on selling you and paying you to be there. It's a symbiotic relationship where you got to know that you are the draw, and if you can't draw at the local scene, if you think they're harsh at the UFC level, these guys at the local level go through it like it's crazy. So that being said, where I'm coming from is amateur MMA versus professional MMA. The difference is a $250 to show and $100 to win. So why would you risk the future of your career when we're talking about the next Ultimate Fighter featuring only undefeated fighters as professionals? So now we're talking about you got a chance to learn and grow as an amateur and become the fighter that you need to be even be considered a true professional. Why would you jump the ship so quickly and jump from amateur to pro when amateur is where you can grow? So all that being said, the reason I pointed to that is this kid's amateur record is insane. It's not just the undefeated aspect of it, it's the guys that he beat all had winning records. For the most part, there's a couple of sprinkled in that were maybe tied 1-1, whatever, or 0-0, but the idea being he made that legacy as an amateur against winners. And that is something that is completely undersold in mixed martial arts. People don't talk about it enough. They don't even acknowledge it as an aspect. They look at the win-loss record, okay? It's like a pitcher in baseball. I always do this because it's my second sport. But you can be a pitcher and get shelled for 12 runs. If your team scores 13 runs, you still get the W. Look at the win column. Don't
right.
You pitch. You know what I mean? So in MMA, it's the same. If you beat a guy that's 4-11, you went and put some work in and got some practice in, and then you went home with another W. That doesn't mean that you were challenged or that you were taken into deep waters or were able to swim there. So that stands out big to me, and that takes the next layer about this kid. What impresses me is his management. He's got the people behind him. He's obviously talented. He's able to not only win fights, but finish fights, and he's doing it in impressive fashion in 2 different divisions. And someone's back there behind him making the right decisions because this kid's on his way. So yes, to answer all your questions, he checks off a lot of boxes for me, and I think that this kid's well on his way.
So the question now is he ready now? And that's something I've been thinking about, the past couple of days after kind of watching his last fight, because 6-0 as a professional, like we mentioned, had like 30 fights as an amateur. He's beating guys that have winning records. And if you look at both the flyweight division, which is more likely he's probably going to compete in the UFC in that division because he's a natural flyweight. Bantamweight, he's not that big as a bantamweight, but he could do both. He's proven it. But you look at the flyweight and bantamweight division in the UFC, I think he could go right in there and as a flyweight, and I think he could be a top 10 guy because there's some guys that compete in that 125 division for the organization today that I think a lot of fighters in other regional circuits, we talk about Titan FC, some of the other shows out there, they have guys in their flyweight division that I think are a little bit better than the ones that are signed by the UFC. What do you think, man? You think he's ready to step in there probably within the next couple months and start doing some big things?
I'll tell you this, in light of his professional record, which again I just got done debunking that in general from across the boards. If you told me 6-0, let's throw this kid in the UFC, I'd say no. Let's get him 9, 10. Let's get him 11 fights under his belt. Whether he wins or loses them, let's get this kid seasoned. But you said it. How many amateur fights this kid done under his belt? There's no more seasoning to be done. It's just how strong is the competition that you're testing yourself against. So he's 6-0. He's proving he can hold, and not just win, but hold titles in 2 divisions and in a elite organization like Titan FC, which is a platform organization for guys to jump off of. He's shown it. He's proven it. So give this kid a crack maybe a little sooner than you might give your average MMA fighter. I think he's turned some heads. And, man, I would like to see what he does. And to take it a step further, when you think of the 125-pound division of the UFC, you said it. I hate to say this, but it's a little stale. I mean, when you get a guy like Mighty Mouse at the top, I mean, you can only bounce guys off of him so many times before it's like, who else? What are we going to do with this guy? Retire him? Like, what do you do? You go find some fresh meat. You know what I mean? And this kid, would probably definitely throw his name in the hat or his hat in the ring for competition to drive towards that type of shot.
I think the same thing. I think that division, it's kind of struggled for ever since it was created back in 2012. You have Demetrius Johnson, who is pound for pound the best fighter in the world. He surpassed Anderson Silva's record for most consecutive title defenses, and he's beaten really tough guys. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to discredit the guys that he's beating because they are world class. But aside from those guys, aside from like the top 5 in that 125 weight class in the UFC, the rest of them, you can make a case that like, hey, these guys aren't really UFC caliber for some of them, And I think a guy like Jose Torres, and he called out Jared Brooks, who was I think ranked top 15 in the UFC for the flyweight division. So that would be a good kind of foot in the door fight for him. I think Torres would look very impressive against Jared Brooks, and that would set him up for maybe a fight with a guy like Ray Borg or somebody that's a little higher ranked up there to kind of fast track his way to a title shot. Because again, that division, like you said, it is a little stale and it is kind of wide open in the sense that they need new stars. Joseph Benavidez, he's like been the number 2 ranked guy in that division for years, but nobody wants to see him fight Demetrius Johnson again. So it's like it's a lot easier path to a flyweight title shot in the UFC than it is for, say, a 35 or 45 pound title shot.
Definitely. And what a great opportunity for Titan FC as well. I know from first-hand experience down here in Arizona, the WFF, sure, you want a guy like Roman Salazar cracking skulls in Tucson and Phoenix, putting asses in the seats. But at the same time, when that guy gets in the UFC, and you can say, hey, we developed this kid, not we, the gym developed him, the camp developed him, but we gave him the opportunity to perform. And then he jumps off to the UFC, you turn around to the next batch of fighters, and you're like, listen, if you come in here and you do well, there's an opportunity in front of you. And that bodes well for organizations like Titan. I think of, talking about amateur, the idea of how many fighters they send to the UFC, the World Fighting Federation. These are organizations that are legit. It's not just, hey, we're going to pay you to crack each other up and see how many drunk guys we can get to buy 30 fights. It's literally, we want to put you in a position where you are recognizable and you have a brand before you put your resume in or call Sean Shelby. And hey, it works, and it works both ways for the fighter and for the organization. So it's great to see Titan FC continue to put out these top-level fighters that are finding their way to the elite levels of the sport.
Absolutely. Well, moving forward, I want to talk about kind of a storyline that's going on right now in MMA that's not being talked about enough, and it is the One Championship out there in Asia, which is, I think, run by, Rich Franklin, who's former UFC middleweight champ. I think he's like one of the CEOs or presidents for it. And basically, their welterweight champion, Funky Ben Askren. This is a guy that he's undefeated, 17-0, I believe is his record. He's been fighting for a very long time. And consensus, that's a tongue twister right there. Consensus, goddamn. Consensus, number 1 ranked welterweight outside of the UFC for years. He's kind of reminds me a little bit of Fedor in the sense that we always want to see Funky Ben Askren fight in the UFC and fight guys like Tyron Woodley, Robbie Lawler, guys like that. And for whatever reason, it never happened. And now he's retiring, and his retirement fight is against Shinya Aoki, who, hardcore fans know who Shinya Aoki is. He's been around for several years. He's a submission wizard. But, he's not really a guy that's going to test Ben Askren, in my opinion. I think Askren's going to, aside from the small chance that maybe Askren gets caught in a leg lock or caught in a submission, which I don't see happening, I think Askren's going to take him down, wrestle him to a decision, maybe even TKO him. But, part of me is kind of bummed because it's like, this is a guy that you really wanted to see test himself against the best in the world, and just for whatever reason, never got to fight under the bright lights of the UFC. And now he's retiring undefeated, which is very tough to do. But, man, Todd, what's your take, man? I mean, do you think this is a good move on Askren's part, or are you thinking kind of like me, like, man, this guy, I really wish he would have gotten that opportunity to fight in the UFC or something along those lines?
It's a really good question, and where I fall with Ben Askren is both from personal experience and also just as a fan. One of the things that I've always tried to follow the multiple broad spectrum of MMA, and I remember when Askren was just getting started, and he was fighting in like a mall in downtown Missouri for Bellator before anyone knew what Bellator was, and he was winning tournaments, and that, as we talked about last week, is, to my estimation, the purest form of combat arts is tournament format. You see it in karate, you see it in wrestling, you see it in judo, you see everything. That's how you figure out who the best guy is. But for some reason, in MMA, it goes the route of boxing and it turns into matchmaking. That being said, Ben Askren was winning serious MMA competition. It lasted over months, over a season, if you will. So I was always really impressed with his ability to do that. And something else that impressed me is what I would call the GSP-esque aspect of him, is that Ben Askren is going to fight you how he decides that he wants to fight you. And if you can't stop him from doing what he's really, really good at, you're going to continue to get beat by that way of doing things, even though you spent 2 months of your life preparing to not let him do that. And he's still doing it. So that tells me that this is an elite level athlete that is elite in a certain skill set. We never really got to see how good his striking was because no one ever put him in a position where he had to throw that many hands. So you talk about a Shinya Aoki. Shinya Aoki is in the best position to defeat Ben Askren because they both want to be where they're going to wind up, which is on the ground. Shinya is the best opportunity to defeat him is coming from that particular neighborhood. But again, I'm with you. I don't see it happening. If it hasn't happened yet, it's not going to happen. And crazy things happen in MMA. But the whole retirement aspect, if you're going to go out, and it's nice to go out, especially when I see Japan-based promotion. Shinya's huge over there. It's a super fight for them. You know what I mean? It's
right.
David versus the life.
Oh, yeah.
So they're really excited about that over there. And Japanese fans, to hear my friend Don Fry tell it, they're the greatest fans on the planet. And I believe it. I haven't seen so many pride shows and stuff like that. But anyways, I don't think he's done. I think he's got more to offer. But knowing Ben personally, not personally, we don't chum it up together, but we've talked on several occasions.
Right.
Ben's very, very confident in what Ben is doing and how Ben is doing it. There's no second guessing. There's no, he doesn't need reassurance. He's very confident. He's very in tune with where he's at and what he wants to do. And if he wants to do something else, he could be a collegiate coach for wrestling. He could be an Olympic coach.
Yeah.
The guy's got plenty of options and alternatives. He's not like every other wrestler that, hey, this was the next step. He's the elite level, even in the wrestling community. He's an animal in a sense. So he's got a future ahead of him that doesn't involve getting punched in the face or getting arms ripped off, which doesn't happen to him often.
Right.
But, I can buy into why he's doing it. But you think about Conor McGregor, I hate to contrast this, but he's so well off already, he never has to put on the glove again in his life.
Exactly.
Then you got a guy like, again, this guy's not in the same ballpark as McGregor, Askren in a financial standpoint, but he doesn't ever have to waste up this little skin. So, if it's time for him and that's what his family wants him to do, and he's got options on the table, fine. But as a fan, hell yeah, I want to see him in the UFC. I want to see if someone can stop him from doing what he does.
Right.
Someone's out there that can do it, right?
I tell you, a fight between him and Woodley would have been fun to watch. It might not have been maybe not the most exciting fight in the world. Most casual fans might have booed it because it's two wrestlers going against each other, and they might have negated each other. I mean, you look at Woodley and Maya. That fight was not that great, but it would have been interesting to see can Askren take Woodley down and keep him there. That would be tough because Woodley's such a good wrestler. And then what happens when those guys stand up? I mean, Woodley, obviously, he's got a ton of knockout power. We haven't really seen much from Askren standing up, so Man, that would have been fun to see. But like you said, man, anytime these guys can walk away from the sport financially in good shape, they don't have to take any more unnecessary shots to the head and stuff like that, and they can do well without fighting. You're happy for him, right? And I'm happy for Ben Askren, and obviously his family is definitely going to be happy to have more time with him, I would imagine. So, but like you said, as a fan, it's like, man, like I wish we could have seen what he could have done against guys like Woodley and Lawler and upper echelon welterweights. But, sometimes they just don't happen.
No, it's true. And for me, like, if I were going to throw a dream fight out there, and I wouldn't have said this 2 months ago, but now that he's back, can you imagine him in GSP, and maybe not even in an MMA match, just put him in a wrestling match? Can you imagine? I mean, those guys, from a pure, here we are, the fight purists, right? From a pure competition and technical just capability and technique standpoint, can you imagine those two fighting? I mean, that's fun, man, just to watch them work each other over.
It definitely would be an anticipated fight, and it sucks that we're not going to get to see it. It's kind of like with Fedor years ago when it was like, man, I want to see him at Couture or him and Brock when Brock was at the top, or but sometimes things just don't pan out in MMA. But I want to talk about real quick the fight card next weekend, and this is kind of crazy because it's like every weekend until the end of the new year, the UFC are doing fights, and it's one of those things where it's like you'll have fight cards like last weekend that were awesome, just like back-to-back exciting fights, and then you'll have a snooze fest kind of like the one last night. So I'm not sure what to expect from the Fight Night Shanghai card in China, but I'll tell you what though, how about Michael Bisping? This guy is a fucking just a warrior. The guy gets choked out and beaten, loses his title from George St. Pierre just 2 or 3 weeks ago, and already he's somehow getting cleared to fight again to main event UFC Fight Night in China against Kelvin Gastelum. And here's my thing, like, isn't it kind of odd though that like they pulled Mark Hunt out of his fight with Tiberia because he posted some kind of blog post where he was saying he can't remember certain things, and like, he's taking a lot of headshots. So Dana White basically said, "Oh, I'm looking out for his physical well-being, and I'm removing him from this fight and putting Fabricio Verdum in there instead." But then you have Bisping, who just fought 3 weeks ago, was finished, and somehow gets medically cleared. What's your take on it, man? And what do you think about this fight?
So there's two things. To your point about, hey, how's this guy fighting again in 3 weeks or 2 weeks? Part of it is the athletic commission, right? So you're going from, where did you fight GSP? Was it Canada?
No, that was, I think, in Vegas. No, that was New York. That was Madison Square Garden.
Okay, no, that's right, Madison Square Garden, you're right. So now they're going to China, so I don't know how that correlates from one athletic commission to the other, especially inter-country. I mean, there are universal rules, but I know that you get away with certain things in Brazil that you can't get away with in Vegas. So, I mean, you follow me there.
Right.
And the idea of Bisping turning it around is actually what most impresses me about this fight. And I'm going to say this, I've not been the biggest fan of Bisping over his career. Like, if you were going to tell me Bisping was fighting a wet tracksuit, I'm voting for a wet tracksuit. You know what I'm saying?
The wet tracksuit. Awesome.
I'm like, wait a minute. You know what? There are certain things that will turn me around on people, and if you're gonna go in there, give up your title, GSP beat you, chokes you out, you went to sleep. How are you eating